get this conversation going. Kat, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Murti. I am the Executive Director of Feminists for Liberty and also the Comms Director over at the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and a member of the DC chapter. So a little bit of overlap for me with this event there. And I'm also on the board of an organization called Students for Sensible Drug Policy, in which capacity I chaired the intersectionality committee. It's gone by different names, but the intersectionality committee for a little over 8.5 years, and just ended that chairship recently.
Nice. And then lastly, Liz. Oh, Liz, you're muted.
That's Zoom bingo right there.
I keep doing this. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I just had to be the first to do it, so great. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Nolan Brown, or Liz. I co-founded Feminists for Liberty with Kat, and I'm now the president of Feminists for Liberty. I'm also a senior editor at Reason Magazine, and yeah, excited to be talking about this issue tonight. I met Ibis at a Ladies of Liberty Alliance thing a few years back, a conference they held in DC, and I'm really excited about the new venture that she started. And when she asked us to talk about this, I was like, yeah, this is something we don't usually talk about actually at Feminists for Liberty a lot, but we should, and I'm really excited to be having this conversation today.
Yay. All right, so.
Okay, wait.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess, yeah. Ibis, do you want me to kick off with questions then?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were gonna, okay. Anyways, so yeah, what we're gonna talk about this panel tonight is probably threefold. What does diversity and inclusion, which is a phrase you hear a lot, diversity and inclusion in the workplace mean? Why is it good from various perspectives? And how do we get there without state coercion or sort of, using government force? So I want to start by sort of talking about, in the US, we use diversity as sort of shorthand for racial or ethnic diversity a lot of the time. But there are obviously a lot of different kinds of diversity, especially in certain industries, that there are still many, women now make up, half or over half of the workplace in some industries, or, the majority in some industries, but also there are still a lot of places where women actually still are a minority. And so even, talking about that is diversity, increasing women in the workplace. Diversity can mean hiring people from different religions or gender identities or different sexualities. But then that also runs us up against things like how, those are kind of none of an employer's business also, maybe, and also sometimes illegal. So how do you deal with that? Diversity can also mean, hiring people who aren't a huge part of the typical applicant pool maybe, or just the people that don't have insider connections to a lot of jobs. So, thinking about hiring people who don't necessarily come from prestigious universities or, have all the right internships, people from different geographic areas, people who have, physical disabilities or sort of neuroatypicalities or criminal records or things like that. So they usually get passed over for jobs, even though there's no reason that they are not good candidates for them. And then, we don't talk about all these different elements of diversity, and we also don't talk about sort of how we get there from a free market perspective. So just to start off, though, that's a sort of overview of some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. But to start off, I'm just going to kick it off with Ibis and then Kat. What does diversity in the workplace, diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, thanks, Liz.
And start with, sorry.
Right, so I mean, exactly like you said, I think like diversity is kind of shorthand for diversity and inclusion. A lot of people think that a lot of these terms are just very interchangeable and synonymous with each other. So with like any of my trainings, my presentations, I always like to say that those are the 2 or 3 very distinct concepts. So diversity means like, what are the characteristics that make you unique? Like, be it your gender, be it your race, be it your ethnicity. It's just checking off the boxes. Like, what makes up you? What are the, 3, 4, 5 qualities that mostly define your experience, that mostly inform how you experience the world and how people experience you, and vice versa. That is it. So diversity, for instance, like looking at everyone in this chat, it would just be like, inviting everyone here to a party. That's it. You've checked the boxes. That's diversity. And then there's equality and equity. Those are also two terms that tend to be used as synonymous with each other interchangeably, but they're not. So the way I like to work, especially with these two words in particular, is with metaphors. So equality is giving everyone a shoe, just a shoe. The problem is that shoe may not fit, but you gave everyone the same shoe, right? Whereas equity is taking that time to give everyone a shoe that fits them. So it's putting a little more effort into acknowledging for people to have access to opportunity. What is the personalized approach they need to grow and achieve, be it like a job promotion or even getting into a job, or whatever the goal is, what are the specific metrics that you need to meet to help that group or that individual? And then inclusion is an attitude. It's what culture are you cultivating at work that makes people feel included, like they feel respected, they feel like their opinion has weight. So it's the culture that management and staff cultivate every day to make people, again, like feel heard, respected, to ensure access to opportunities. So this is where, when you're answering questions about the second part, diversity and inclusion, like, what is your work culture like? Do you invite your employees' feedback sincerely? Do you check in with your team as a group and individually? What kind of questions do you ask them? It's really like where the difference is made is not just checking those boxes in terms of, okay, like I have X amount of women, X amount of foreigners, X amount of this, like I'm good. That's only really half the equation. But in terms of the culture, what are you doing to promote engagement and therefore higher productivity? So I want to hand it off to Kat.
Yeah, I definitely agree on those things. And I think that, a lot of times when, especially early on when conversations about diversity started, people really did view it, companies, organizations viewed it as like the checkbox, right? Like we need to have one person of each race in our photo for our brochure. And you're really selling yourself short at that point, because there's the value of diversity is actually a very libertarian one. And it's that we each have our own different, each have our own different set of skills, the things that we are good at, different things that we bring to the table, right? And if you're just letting people, if you're bringing in people for that, but you're not letting them have any impact, if your culture isn't adapting around that, if there's not any real change or any real engagement happening around those things, you're not going to get any of the actual value that comes from diversity. I also want to talk a little bit more about another term that we hear in this space a lot. I already mentioned it once, intersectionality. And I feel that a lot of libertarians in particular respond poorly to intersectionality. They hear they hear it and they see it almost as like, oh, that's just reverse racism, or you're just putting people in boxes, or I hear like cultural Marxism. And in fact, intersectionality as a theory, now I'm not going to say that everybody who uses the word intersectionality is using it in this way, but I think we have to go back to its founder. The founder of intersectionality theory is a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And so she was responding actually to feminism, and what she saw is like this, what we now call white feminism, that was a feminism that essentially said, okay, this is good for these feminists or these women, therefore it's good for everybody. And she says, that's not actually true, because am I a woman? Yes, but I'm also a Black woman, and that's a part of my identity that also shapes this. And I'm not just a Black woman, I'm also a queer woman, and I'm a woman in academia, and all of these different aspects of who I am change who my perspective on the world and the way the world perceives me. So intersectionality is taking that same diversity thing that Ibis, you were talking about in terms of like, oh, all of these different characteristics that make us up, and realizing that it doesn't make sense to sort of have just this collectivist idea that like, oh, okay, because you're a woman, you think this, or because of a woman, you need this, because you're not just a woman, right? You are an individual, and as an individual, you might have many different identities, but all of those different identities, all of those different identities are at play when you approach the world and when the world approaches you. And so that really the idea of intersectionality is that we're kind of looking at how all of these different aspects and how these different trends and different ways that different demographics might experience the world are how each of those is not one specific thing that can become a monolith, but each of us, despite all of these overwhelming trends on different demographic areas, how each of us is still an individual who is going to experience that very differently.
So you just sort of touched on this, Kat, about, you know, both of you guys did, about why, you know, diversity and inclusion and, you know, intersectionality in the workplace is good for sort of what might be deemed moral reasons, why it's important, why it's, I mean, hopefully, you know, everyone doesn't have to learn these, but I'm just saying, you know, like why it is good from a moral perspective. But there are also a lot of arguments about why it is good for business,
yes,
why it is good. So I'd like y'all to address some of those. And also, it's probably good for keeping government mandates at bay, which can just sort of make all of this more complicated. Not saying, you know, like, oh, you know, a lot of times when people, you say, I don't want the government to mandate, you know, these sort of quotas or whatever, different, you know, initiatives to verify, to, you know, a certain different kinds of diversity in the workplace, however they define it. It's people think like, oh, because you don't agree with that. And it's like, no, it's not because you don't agree with that. It's just because when the government, you know, especially the federal government gets involved in sort of setting these things and setting them in a sort of uniform standard and taking upon itself to define what this means and what every business and what every, you know, no matter what size or where has to define it to mean, it can be very problematic. So, yeah, that's sort of the next question. Why is this desirable for other than sort of just obviously, you know, moral reasons?
Yeah, definitely. So that, I feel like that's a two-part question, so I'm going to hit on both the parts. But yes, I mean, like, hopefully, most of us believe that it's good to have a world in which people have an equal right to opportunities. People have an ability to go out and do do their own best in the world and not be held back by various restrictions, right? But I think that there's much more than just that simple moral case for equality. I think there's also several studies that have been conducted on this, and overwhelmingly diversity in the workplace is good for the bottom line. Companies that have women in leadership positions make up to 20% higher profits. Companies that have publicly visible women in leadership positions tend to also be more popular as companies and have more support from the public, have better name recognition. People feel better about those companies. They tend to weather crises better. And it's not just women. I mean, this obviously happens across the board, right? Where we're also increasingly, you know, government has held a lot of people out of the marketplace for a very long time, right? Think about how much farther we would be as a society if more than half the population hadn't been prevented from being scientists and doctors and, you know, writers for, you know, centuries, right? And it's not just women, it's basically anybody who wasn't a very wealthy white man for a very long time was not allowed to participate in these things. And as those largely legal, although also cultural boundaries have been lifted, we're seeing more and more participation in the economy, not just in terms of labor, but also in terms of capital. Like, the people who are in the stores buying things and who have the money to spend, who are making those decisions, are increasingly are increasingly women, are increasingly, you know, openly gay people, people of color, immigrants. And, you know, if you want to sell their products to them, you need to have people on your team who understand it. There's a great example of this. It's a marketing joke that comes up a lot, but there's a major fail. The Chevy made the Nova car. It was extremely popular in the United States. They decided to expand it into an international market, and it crashed basically in Latin America. Why? Well, if they'd had any Spanish speakers, I think, on that decision team, they might have told them that Nova means doesn't go, won't drive, essentially, in Spanish. And so, you know, that's not a great way to sell your car. So that's definitely to the first point. I want to let Ibis respond a little bit on that, but I would love to get back on the government mandates as well, too, because I have a lot of thoughts on that before we switch. I know Ibis has some thoughts here too.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Kat. I mean, it's like exactly what you said. I was just looking up some stats as well from the McKinsey Institute. So they're a consulting and research firm, and they did all these studies like across the world, thousands of companies. And like you said, at minimum 20%, their findings came back that if you had a very visibly like ethnically and culturally diverse board, you were 43% more likely to experience higher profits. And like, so like, again, like, why is that? Because when you have more diverse perspectives, you have a lot more innovative forces going on within your workplace, increased positive customer service, more creativity in how to meet demands. Like, you know, when you think of all these ways that you can get all these goods and services now, like for example, think, you know, just like before apps became very commonplace and you had to example, like you needed to place an order for food, you had to call for like your pizza, right? But now that you can get your pizza through an app, or I think I was reading that Domino's actually, they are just like killing the pizza delivery game, because for years they've been diversifying the amount of ways that you can order their pizza. It can be over Facebook Messenger, through an app, one click, buy a pizza. And so for instance, like, I mean, if you're someone that has, for what, you know, again, like you are like a person with a disability, it's difficult for you to speak on the phone, you can just go into your app and order electronically. If you have social anxiety and it's really difficult for you to speak with people, you know, you can just order through an app. Like I was thinking even, you know, beyond COVID, now that like Uber Eats has rolled out this, like, just leave the food at the door. I'm like, that can do wonders, like for people, not just, you know, for the risk of getting infected with COVID or what have you, but it's increasing the options that they're, you know, so if meeting someone at the door just for whatever reason makes you nervous, or for what, you know, that it's just more options means more people can buy into your product or your service. There's just, you know, so many possibilities with this. And I think like what Liz was saying earlier, now that like, of course, like history is never really linear, but for the most part, the pattern is that people do fight for their rights and get their rights recognized economically and socially over time. So now that your consumer base and your talent base is getting a lot more buying power, like Kat was saying, your talent pool and your workforces need to reflect that as well. So like for instance, I was just researching through the LA Times that in a matter of not even 10 years, give it like 8, 1 out of every 10 workers in the workforce is going to be a Latina. Latina women like myself are graduating college at much higher rates, where there's a lot more upward mobility in terms of, you know, in terms of our careers. And so just having just that increased presence of you know, talent, like we're buying products and services, where, you know, we need to be in the boardrooms as well. It's just all around. At this point, it's an inevitability. Or like, for instance, like when I was talking with a very dear, like, trans friend of mine, you know, I think he said something that very profound. It's for example, it's not if you get a trans employee or customer, it's really a matter of when, you know, because now people are coming out, they feel much more comfortable, the culture is really, you know, changing to make a lot of, you know, things, identities more acceptable that were more stigmatized in the past. So it's, you know, and like Liz was saying, it shouldn't be about waiting for some big Supreme Court decision or some government mandate to, like, force you to, to make certain decisions. Like, you really want to mold it to whatever fits your company best, whatever fits your needs best, but in a way that you're also servicing, your customer base as well as your talent pool.
Right. And so that's actually a great time for me to come back in with my diatribe against government mandates, because, I get a lot of people who are pretty surprised, who are like, okay, yes, you're a feminist. You're telling me that having a more diverse workplace is better for the bottom line. I'm a capitalist. So that's generally a positive thing, I personally think. Then why do you oppose government mandates that would do this? And here's the problem. It's actually twofold, right? One is that whenever we have a regulation of any kind, all that does is lock in whatever the current cultural mindset around something is, and reduce that flexibility that we see from markets that allows those changes to happen, that is causing those changes to happen, right? Like, we don't have companies choosing to come out in support of gay pride or Black Lives Matter because the government is telling them to. They're doing it because the overwhelming number of their customers want them to and will support them, and they will earn more money if they respond to that, right? It's not because it's culture changes much more quickly and much more easily than government. Government tends to lock in, and so we kind of will get these mandates that end up holding us back. But it's more than just that. It's also that we have this reactionary impact to these things, right? So we've talked about how valuable it is to have women in your C-suite, women in your boardroom. Yet, so it's starting to get popular the first law in the U.S. was actually just recently passed in California, requiring companies above a certain size to have at least one woman on their board. So that hasn't been around in the US for long enough, but we have seen similar laws in other countries. And what we've seen as the impact has largely been that when the government is saying that this has to happen, when the government is mandating these kinds of diversity measures, what ends up happening is that those people, so that women in the workplace are no longer taken as seriously. People see them as, oh, you're just a diversity hire. They don't listen to them. They don't have as much efficacy or as much power in the work sphere, and you actually lose those positive impacts. And there's a number of different ways. I know we're probably going to talk about some workplace policies and things, and I think that that's just a really good mindset to look at with these things over and over and over again. What we end up seeing is that it's culture and cultural change that drives the positive changes. And when we bring government into that equation, even when, and it's not always, but even when that government intrusion is coming from a positive place, it still ends up holding people back and marginalizing them further.
Ibis?
No, I think exactly. No, like it's no. I mean, it's really interesting. I think like some time ago, it just occurred to me. I think there was a really interesting a survey that was distributed in, I believe, in California, a very densely populated state, where, interestingly enough, affirmative action has actually been banned in California since the 90s. And I know everyone's like, oh, California, of course they would pass these laws. So for example, this law now requiring at least one woman to be on an executive board is it's an introduction of, it's been at least 25 years, if you think about it, since they've even considered, I think, a required mandated quota like that. So I think, Kat, to your point about culture, what's really interesting is that when the survey, because it was meant to take a temperature of how people felt about affirmative action, and it really stuck with me because when it was framed in the way of giving diverse hires, or I think this was more in regards to college acceptance rates, giving minority students or female students a leg up over other students, when it was framed as a diversity student taking the place of someone else, people reacted really negatively to that. But so the surveys, for the most part, reflected that people were not in favor of the idea of affirmative action. But when the question was framed as to help diversify, to increase the world standing, when the culture behind that question was just different, people reacted a lot more positively to like the idea of affirmative action. So I think it speaks really powerfully to what you were saying. It's more about, like you said, it's the culture, it's the mentality that goes into your hiring and retention process and your work culture. If that's something that you inherently, so again, like whatever criticisms or anything about affirmative action aside, it's just the phrasing and the implications that came with framing it two different ways. I think it was just so interesting. Like when when people feel, especially at the executive level, the administrative level, when they feel inspired to do good, they will do good.
Yes.
And I think, like you said, but then when you're forced to it, it can end up like you said, like very much backfiring. So it's something that you need to determine. I mean, sometimes like when I work with clients, I say from the get-go, do you have a diversity and inclusion statement? Is this something that you highlight as part of your company values? Is this, does this drive everything that you do? Does this frame everything that you do? Because if you don't have that, then what do you have to work with when you want to meet those diversity and inclusion metrics?
Yeah, I definitely think it is about the culture, right? And so we've been talking a lot about gender in the workplace here, but there's another really good example, ban the box laws, right? So
Yes.
ban the box is something that on its face looks very good to me as someone who cares about criminal justice and stuff like that. So the idea is, when you have a box that people have to check on a job application that says, do you have any prior convictions? That immediately sets a bunch of people just back. They're not going to apply because they assume that therefore they're not going to get the job. Or especially now that a lot of these resumes and applications go through algorithms and things like that, they're getting sorted out before anyone even sees them. So you're not really looking at the candidate because they had a pot conviction 25 years ago or whatever it is, right? So generally speaking, ban the box is not great. And lots of companies, including major companies, I know Georgia Pacific's one of them, have gotten rid of the boxes on their application for this reason. And they've seen it go really positively. However, there have also been movements by very well-meaning criminal justice activists to have ban the box be passed as a law, saying that companies cannot ask this question, at least until there is an actual offer on the table. They can ask, but they can only ask like once they're going to offer it to someone and they're going to do a background check, right? They can't ask in those early stages. And this really highlights the need for that cultural buy-in around these ideas, because what they ended up seeing is when there is ban the box, what actually ends up happening is young Black men without any criminal history are suddenly not getting callbacks at a much higher rate, because the people who have had to ban the box but would include the box and are not at all sold on these ideas are also holding on to these other stereotypes that tell them that young Black men are more likely to be criminals. And therefore, they're just straight out the box, not hiring, not even looking at applications from young Black men. And so like this, again, like we need to start with that cultural change around the fact that, around why we're doing this, get people to buy in on the market level rather than trying to impose it from government when we start to see these kind of reactions.
Actually, yeah, Kat, I mean, to your point, like I remember when we were talking and planning for this panel, right? I was like all gung-ho, like, yes, ban the box, because again, like I agree, like it's first of all, it's embarrassing. Why should you have to put something like so personal that you may have already dealt with? I mean, if you had to do your prison sentence, you finished it, you paid off your dues, like, it's cleared. So why do you have to like revisit something so intimate, and over and done with over and over again, like re-traumatizing yourself in your job applications, right? But
it's the first thing people know about you too, right?
Is maybe like it should just be sort of not like it should be up to the company whether or not they ask that question?
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. The companies that get rid of the box on their own actually do see positive responses, but the companies that have to because of a law just end up hiring far fewer young Black men.
That's what was really interesting, yeah, because it's again, it's the law just kind of addressing like this little pinpoint, but then there's this whole wave of implications that come after. So like when I was reading that that article that you sent me about it from Cato, it was that it's like without that box, people would then rely on like their own prejudices, and actually that would like amplify a lot of the racism and the bias in the hiring process. So, you know, it's almost reforming, like, you know, again, like tweaking that mentality of like, even if somebody has or had a criminal past, they're, you know, they're showing up because they want to work. That's positive. That's a good thing. You should want, you know, you should want to at least offer them the chance to prove themselves through the interview process. So it's like you said, all these algorithms that already automatically throw out those applicants in the process, you know, you're not giving them a fair shake. So that was a really interesting, I mean, I learned it literally 2 days ago. So such an like unintended consequence.
I did a very libertarian thing and sent Ibis a bunch of studies.
No, but all like, you know, all verified and very well, you know, like thought out, and the social experiment, you know, or saying, I mean, it's like when you see also those resume studies as well, that when, or even recently, I think like there was a resume sent out as Joe and another one identically sent out as Jose, and, you know, predictably Joe got a lot more calls back than Jose. So, you know, again, like it's like bias, whether it's conscious, you know, like you're overtly racist and you don't want, you know, Black people, Latino people, whomever working for you, or it's unconscious, where again, like because you figure, you rationalize saying like, oh, well, you know, it's just, we don't want people with criminal tendencies working here. That just wouldn't be good for us, you know, and you kind of like, you massage it that way in your brain. You think like, oh, you know, but I'm doing something good for the company, but you may not realize that like people are complex and they evolve, and you're denying someone a job that may make them just go through that cycle all over again, which is a whole other conversation. But you are a part of that process of possibly helping them to get out and to move on and ahead. So
yeah, those resume studies, they've done a whole bunch of them. There's just tons of them on different like racial names, male versus female, etc. And there's just tons of them, and overwhelmingly over and over and over again, we see the same biases come out of them. And what's really interesting is that you could say, okay, yeah, people are just being overtly racist, but it's not. It's actually, for a lot of people, it's just these heuristics in their brain, because they've also done the ones where they show them the same thing that has the man's name versus the woman's name, exact identical resume, and they ask them to describe the candidates. I've only seen it for a couple seconds, which is about how long most hiring managers see a resume for.
Oh, seconds,
and, yeah, but they have totally different pictures of what that candidate looks like, even, and what the qualities of that candidate are, even though everything except for the name is identical.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this has all been super interesting. But I think, what about people who aren't necessarily people who are not trying to be, they don't have these preconceived notions, they actively want to, you know, have a more diverse and inclusive workplace. It's still really hard, and it's really hard for reasons that are very complicated. So I wanted to ask about some of these things, like how do we, you know, even when organizations really want to increase all sorts of, you know, diversity in their workplace, how do you do that without feeling like you're tokenizing people? How do you do that without invading people's privacy? Because I mean, especially when we're not, well, I mean, when you're just looking at a resume, you know, we were just talking about not wanting to make assumptions based on people's names or based on just whatever you sort of, you know, their gender, their sex, whatever you sort of glean in a few seconds that trigger these sort of frames in your mind that Kat was talking about. But you can't just ask people about that. Sometimes just out of a tact reason, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes because it really is sort of none of an employer's business necessarily about, you know, what an applicant's, you know, sexuality is, or religion is, or gender identity is. So how do we square that? And how do people, you know, hiring managers, people at organizations, you know, not necessarily even professional organizations, but nonprofits, and, you know, how do we address the wanting to have and actively seek a more diverse workplace with these sort of privacy concerns and things like that?
So I think you touched on a really good point where it's like, the thing is that if you feel compelled for whatever reason to poke and prod in ways that could be construed as invasive, that's already too late in the process. You didn't focus on like your hiring strategies. Like it's like I tell people, it's not about just having candidates find you. How do you find them? And that is a very big part of the equation. So like I know like Kat, like you and I were having a really interesting conversation about, you know, first generation college students. So what that means is that if your family, like your parents and beyond, have not been to college and you're the first one to go to college, a lot of people have this impression that like once you make it to college, especially to like an Ivy League, that's it, you've made it, you know, you can take it from here. But there are so much social politics that go into it because for a lot of these kinds of people, right? It's like you go to this place where all of a sudden, you know, a lot of your classmates, you know, well, my father is such, and we have our yacht on the weekends and our social clubs here and this and that. And it can be really overwhelming to navigate that. I think actually there is a wonderful D&I strategist who is associated with Harvard. He comes from a low-income neighborhood here in Miami, actually. And so he said that when he went to Cambridge, it was like, you know, it was so difficult to navigate all these resources because again, it's like giving everyone the shoe that may not fit, right? So, all right, you all have this education, do with it what you will, but it's how do you personalize that approach so that people can maximize the benefits of these resources that you're giving them. So, you know, I mean, some tips for how to reach, you know, the kinds of candidates that you're looking for, and in such a way that you don't have to question or poke and prod at their identity. You know, it's like making relationships with a lot of high school and college interest groups, because that way you can start generating a talent pipeline where you're getting them young and fresh, they're ready to learn, they can hit the ground running, and you can really take the time to mold them into the kind of worker that you need them to be. And especially if it's, you know, industries like film, for instance. I was recently working with this recent, like the startup. They edit like TV promos and commercials and whatnot. And that's such an industry where it's like, for the most part, you need to have that insider connection, you know, whether it be your parents or because you grew up in it. I told them, like, actively reach out to school. There's a lot of students that like love the idea of working in film, but they just don't have those kinds of like political and social connections. Reach out to them and say, hey, we're creating this summer internship for someone exactly like you. Make that room for them. Also, pay your interns. That is a really big part of it. When you do not pay your interns, you are locking out a lot of low-income students that cannot afford to work for free. And again, just that simple gesture, that decision can make such an impact in terms of the kind of talent that you cultivate within your organization. You know, and even at a college level, make professional relationships with fraternities, sororities that, you know, attract, like, you know, be it like minority students or students from different cultural backgrounds, you know, and offer professional development. Invite them to, you know, invite yourself to be a mentor, you know, cultivate those relationships, because now that I think, you know, between millennials and Gen Z, we are, myself a millennial, we are among the most diverse demographics like in the history of the world. And so, you know, you really want to take advantage of that. And then in terms of like people looking for you, so say, you know, typical job, you know, they're looking on Indeed or Monster.com, just with your job announcement as well, you can make a world of difference. First, I know like a lot of companies, when they use a very generic like EEOC, like we do not discriminate on the basis of race and sex, like very cut and dry, just like copy and paste it on there. Give yourself permission to jazz it up. Like mention, hey, we like millennials. Hey, we have working parents, or, you know, we're LGBT, you know, inclusive. Like, you be specific and make people feel welcome and like you're listening and talking to them specifically. Also, don't use language that can be very intimidating, like a lot of jargon that's very industry specific, because again, you could be excluding talent that could learn quickly on the job. I mean, for instance, like in terms of myself, I'm the program director of a co-working space. I don't have an MBA. I've only lightly worked in real estate before as like a receptionist. And now I'm the on-site business coach. I'm the community manager, because my supervisors gave me the chance to learn a lot of things on the job. And turns out that they're really happy with my performance. Members are happy with me, staff are happy with me. So also give people the chance and just make your job announcement language, you know, like relatable and approachable, still specific to what you need, but not in a way that is so jargony that it scares away people. And also make your benefits known. Don't be afraid of saying, hey, we offer ample vacation time, or if you need you know, a hybrid remote working schedule, mention those things. People are looking for flexibility. So, you know, be as transparent and as inviting as possible when you are announcing your jobs. I think in the hiring process, that makes a huge, huge difference. So,
I'm glad
you know,
you mentioned the education thing too, because before when I was talking and I said, you know, like look to not just like certain colleges, but I should have also said, you know, look to not necessarily always requiring a certain credential for a, you know, position, which I think also holds people back, you know, saying this or that, because yeah, many people can have experience or can learn on the experience and can learn on the job the experience. So, Kat, I want you to answer that question, and then we want to have time for, it's 7:15, we want to have time for some questions. So, and we were still going to maybe talk about, you know, how do we include people once they're there. So, yeah.
I will try to be really fast, which is hard because I talk a lot. But so everything Ibis said was correct, of course. But so I've actually had some experience with this at Students for Sensible Drug Policy at SSDP. This is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly when I was still chairing the intersectionality committee. So we actively in our job listings will list things like college degree not required, because it's not. Like, we want equivalent experience. College degree is good. Not a college degree, perfectly good too. We list things like we do not drug test. We try to use very inclusive language of various types. We make sure, to Ibis's point about EOE, everyone puts the EOE thing in because it's just a way of, you know, I'm going to curse, but it covers your ass legally. That's basically why it's there. Every single job application has it. We put in our hiring and inclusion policy. It's a 2-page long policy that talks about our views on hiring and inclusion in the organization. That is part of every job listing. We also have, we adopted about a year ago, something that's called a Rooney Rule. And so basically a Rooney Rule is that some percentage of the people who move forward in the interview process, some of the people who are moving forward at each stage, should fit in a marginalized community. Now, what that is going to be very different. For instance, if you're hiring for a preschool teacher versus if you're hiring for CEO of a tech company, right? Because you have very different groups who make up the majority. Now, a lot of people will look at that and say like, okay, but then aren't you just saying that that category then is the thing you're hiring on the basis of? But it's not, because what it's actually telling you is, hey, if I don't have any qualified candidates that are worth moving forward, that fit these other bubbles, like that means something bad. That's a flag to me that I've done something where I'm not attracting those kinds of candidates. And so that actually takes it back, because I think it goes before the hiring too. It's about the culture. It's about the inclusion. It's about the picture that you are presenting to people. I do a lot of work in digital, and Facebook did something a couple of years ago where they showed people the same video, same content, but the person in the video was different ages, sexes, genders, you know, races. People watch a video, even though the content is exactly the same, they watch a video for longer when the person in the video looks like them. So that representation point too also matters. Like when someone looks at a company or looks at a place and says, and they see it as, oh yeah, that's a place where I would fit in, where someone like me could do well, they're much more likely to want to engage. So it's just like, that's also a part of it too. I have a lot more to say, but I'm trying to keep it tight.
It was good.
That sort of segues with the last thing I wanted to ask before we open up, which is just, you know, what are some, you know, quick policies to get us there? What are the kind of things, I mean, you guys have already been describing that, but, you know, what are, I think we talked before about, you know, telework and flexible work schedules, and you're talking about the things Kat was just mentioning, but are there any other things you want to mention about, you know, not just how do we get there to be the culture? I think this kind of intertwines to be the culture that, you know, attracts a wide variety of people, but also then how do we make sure that when people are there, it's sustainable and that it feels welcoming and not like a weird, you know, environment.
So I have several ideas, but I do want to start on 3 key policies that I think we need to look at. One of them is parental leave called parental leave that is for people of all genders who are parents, that includes things like adoptive parents. I think that's incredibly important. And encouraging, and not just having it on the books, but encouraging people to take it, and encouraging not just women, but men to take it, non-binary people to take it. That actually pays off not just in the immediate for the workers and who you're able to attract. It also helps, the bottom line in the long run once that becomes the culture of the company. Not as much in the short run, but once that really becomes the culture, you start to see actual payoff in money form. Another big one is to have, pay your interns. Pay your interns is a big one. And telework, flexibility around that, letting people set their own schedules, that's very key as well. And I think that also feeds into something which I think is actually a very deeply capitalistic impulse, or very libertarian impulse, which is it doesn't really matter if someone is at the office from 10 a.m. to midnight or 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. as long as their work product is the same or is good, right? I think that, like, if you look at workers, if you look at the people in your company as individuals and kind of have this open process where between them and their supervisors and the higher ups, there's some decisions about what their job is, what their roles are, what they need to do, and what good looks like, and what like fantastic blowing it out of the park looks like. So everyone's on the same board, and then just let them do it however they need to do it. As long as they're getting the job done, they're getting the job done. It's better for the bottom line, brings you a much more diverse group of workers who are happier and more productive. And it's better for society, in my opinion, as well. So that is,
and that's one of my favorite things about working at Reason as a very libertarian organization, and it's very much about, you know, people sort of working on their own schedules, and people work all around the country, but there's also very, you know, it's not lax in what is expected of people necessarily at all. There are very defined sort of goals, and it's very individualistic in the way they approach people's work arrangements, and I think that's really important. Like, I guess, you know, an individualistic approach to working arrangements can be really beneficial, because it actually gets the best work out of people and makes people feel the most fulfilled too. So it's a win-win situation.
Totally. It's just about trusting people. And when you trust people and they really value that trust, you know, when people feel driven also to like produce for you, like that outlook, it makes such a difference. Because when you're always, you know, when you're working, and I'm sure everyone has had that kind of job, where your boss is constantly micromanaging you, they don't trust you, they think that, you know, at every second, you know, you're going to take advantage to just like, you know, get lazy or whatever. Again, it's like that distrust, and then you put in like the minimum, but not what you could be producing, and not the kind of relationship that you could be having with your teammates, with your supervisor, if applicable. Like, it's just, again, like that benefit of the doubt, that building of trust, that goodwill, it makes a huge difference in productivity, engagement, retention, everything.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the positives that's come out of this coronavirus pandemic. A lot of companies, of CEOs, have realized that not only are people able to be productive when they're working from home, they're actually more productive when they're working from home. Although it does feed back into that cultural element, which is, God, I could say so much about this, but one group of workers who not all of them, but many of them are having more trouble working from home are women with children, specifically because they are now doing schooling, and they're doing more childcare than they were previously. Daycares are closed, schools are closed. And their male spouses are not to the same degree. So that, again, is that same cultural impulse where, as long as the culture views it as women are primarily responsible for everything that happens in the home, you don't get as much of a benefit. But still, overwhelmingly, people are being way more productive when they work from home.
I think we should probably open it up to questions now. If anyone who is tuning in with us, and thank you so much for joining us, has any questions, you can either unmute and ask them. I think, can people do that? Is that technically possible in this call?
I think it'll be better if they
put it in the chat. Okay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, then you can please put them in the chat.
I see one here from Florencia Abram, who says, so do you think characteristics like race and gender should be weighed as a skill/talent at the time of hiring? Wouldn't that be positively discriminating? I have thoughts, but if either of you want to weigh in.
Sure.
That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that's also, you know, again, it's this idea that like there's this perception, right? And that like, oh, well, I mean, if you're a woman or a Black person or whoever, it should be super easy for you to get a job, right? And it's like, actually not at all. Like, it's a lot of unconscious bias is still working the other way, where it's mostly set against candidates who are not, you know, the mainstream, like white, college educated. So I think that it's, you know, the ideal hiring criteria is that you should weigh things against each other. You shouldn't make an all or nothing decision based on one aspect. So be it that, you know, in terms of their education, their gender, their culture, whether they have a disability or not, it should all be things that you should consider with each other and how that could positively or negatively impact your hiring process. But I will say, be very wary of hiring for culture fit. That is a super weaselly way of reinforcing racism or sexism or any other kind of discrimination. Because if you think, you know, who determines the culture? It's whoever's in charge. So if you're, you know, if managers rely like way too heavily on personal referrals, I know we were talking about this the other night as well, like tends to attract like. So when you know, hire people as a personal favor, I mean, once in a while, of course, you know, it is what it is, it's life, right? But also think about does it meaningfully add to your team, or is it just more of the same? You know, so just take each decision and each person case by case. You know, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can be, you know, have it be a complex system. It's okay. You can be, you know, nuanced when it comes to your hiring practices.
I think it goes back actually to what Ibis was saying at the beginning about diversity versus inclusion, right? I think if you only care about diversity because you're trying to check off some sort of tick boxes, if you have some idea of like, okay, we need a woman on this team, we need a Black person on this team, then yeah, then maybe you are looking at those characteristics as like the sole hiring criteria, and you're doing it wrong, right? If you're looking at it more as like, okay, we need somebody who understands things from this perspective for the specific role for this reason, and this person is demonstrating that in their interviews with us when they're talking about how this perspective that they have is good at fulfilling this need that we have, I think that you're going to get a much more diverse workplace in a way that's one, not pandering and offensive, and two, actually going to benefit you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think Mr. J. Edgar pretty much answers it here, you know, amongst the attendees, right? Like it depending on the circumstance. So, you know, it doesn't have to be a black or white, all or nothing kind of thing.
Ryan Crabtree asked, do you feel socioeconomic background is a meaningful dimension of how we should be measuring diversity? I'm gonna start real quick because when Ibis was talking earlier, I was, you know, it was funny to me when I found out that like first generation college student was like a thing that people considered like a disadvantage or like a strange category, because like everyone I knew was a first generation college student for the most part. I mean, me and all of my cousins and many, many people in my hometown are. And I grew up in Ohio. I went to school in Appalachia, and most people I know, you know, didn't do summer internships anywhere because you worked a job over the summer. And when I got to DC for the first time, it was very shocking to me how much was dependent on that sort of thing. People having done these unpaid fellowships or internships throughout their college career, and then leading to, you know, the internship leading to the fellowship leading to a thing, and almost like there being these, I mean, not closed, because, you know, me and plenty of people demonstrate that they were not entirely closed to people who are outside those circles, but it felt like that for a little bit, and it was very surprising. So I do think that this is an important element, and as you know, we talked about earlier, like one of the things you can do is just pay your interns and things like that. You know, Kat and I, it's just us, and we don't, you know, get paid for doing Feminists for Liberty stuff. We put money into it, and but hopefully, you know, we've been saving up as an organization through donations, very generous donations and fundraisers, and we're launching a swag shop soon and stuff. But we are, you know, our goal is we need some help, and we want to pay people first. So like we're not going to start doing that. I mean, even if it's not a whole lot, but we want to make sure that if there's, you know, people who are, we want to make sure that if people are putting time into a thing, they are getting paid for it. And I think that's very important. And it's so funny, sometimes you see the progressive organizations who don't pay their interns while they're like railing about labor laws. But I'm gonna stop rambling now and let either of you take on this question.
No, I think considering your socioeconomic background has so much to do. I mean, I think one of the most impactful books that I've ever read that was recommended to me by a Midwestern friend was Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, and it was just so eye-opening. Like for someone like myself, that I grew up in like South Florida, which is definitely like a bubble in and of itself. You have many people from all kinds of countries. Here, like the minority is the majority. So I think like that was really like my first like, you know, and a well-explained introduction to like Midwestern like white culture, what it's like to be white and poor. That is like it has its own complexities and its own kind of culture and its own circumstances, right? And so like the author, when he joined the military and then he ended up going to an Ivy League for law school, I mean, where he met his wife. Now he seems like settled, and you know, he's a commentator, but and a lawyer, but he had just a horrible transition because he like major imposter syndrome. He's like, you know, I don't belong here. None of my family's ever been to college. And again, from the surface, you know, maybe some SJWs, right, would say like, well, but he's a white man, like that's his role, you know, he should just like blend in, right? But it had, you know, it's still, he had panic attacks, like night terrors. He had a really difficult time transitioning because he himself was a first-generation college student and a law school graduate on top of that. So when there's a big chasm to like where you come from, what you're used to, and he spoke very openly about just growing up poor, like between Ohio and Kentucky, and then all of a sudden being a law school graduate, you know, you need support, and like that has its own set of circumstances, and you know, just considering that as one of many criteria, I think helps you view candidates as just well-rounded human beings. You know, as Kat was saying, in terms of our intersectionality, right? All the different things that make us who we are.
Yeah, I think this is actually where a lot of the resentment around discussions about diversity and privilege and intersectionality come from, because people see it as, well, it was hard for me too, and I'm white, or it was hard for me too, and I'm a man. And the reason that they're seeing that is because it's not just one thing that holds you back or pushes you back. It's because we're all of these different intersections. For me, from my perspective, you know, I did most of my schooling in far north Texas. You know, I went to public schools in Texas, and you know, there are a lot of ways in which being a woman and non-Christian, non-white, the child of immigrants, did cause difficulties in my life. And yet, I definitely think that I had many advantages over a lot of my classmates who, you know, were very, very poor, very, very, very poor, who came from backgrounds where they didn't have family around, they didn't have two parents or even necessarily any parents. Their parents didn't go to school. A lot of them, you know, they had parents who had dropped out, they themselves dropped out. Like, my parents have master's degrees. They came to this country to get master's degrees. They have professional jobs, you know, going back generations. That's kind of been the background that I've come from. Like, I think about this a lot, because if I had been in the exact same town, gone to the exact same school, taken the same classes as my classmates, many of whom I'm still friends with, my life would have been much harder. I probably wouldn't have gone to college. I probably wouldn't have pursued knowledge work. I would have done something very different with my life. I would have had pressure, like a lot of my friends had pressure to drop out when they're 16 and start earning for the family. And so like, that is a huge part of this as well.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, I had pressure the other way to, go to school, excel, get a professional job, that kind of thing, which is just, it was an advantage in my life, honestly.
Okay, should we go on to our next question? We have, I don't know, people can stick around. I mean, we can keep talking for a few more minutes, even though I was this supposed to end at 7:30, right?
I believe so, but that's fine.
One more question.
Sure.
Camilo Gomez, I'm from Latin America, where a lot of and I'm butchering the name, I'm sorry. From Latin America, where a lot of the economy is informal. In my experience, the informal economy is generally more open to women, non-white and non-straight. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
So, I lived in Costa Rica actually for almost 2 years. It's where I got my master's in international human rights law at the UN school there. And so for a while I was doing an internship with a nonprofit that worked with sex workers in San Jose, the capital city. So it is interesting because I mean, especially in countries, like in regions like Latin America, Camilo, which I'm sure you know because you're in Peru, right? So there's still a lot of cultural attitudes like against LGBT people being employed. Even like women will have a hard time being employed. And so the problem is that yes, like the informal economy is pretty much like the catch-all for everyone else, either whether you're a domestic worker or you're a sex worker. But then the problem is that just as easily as you attained that job, you can just easily be kicked out of it or suffer some kind of, lasting, if not fatal consequence because of the lack of protections that you have working in the informal economy. So it's just one of those things where that's where, again, like the culture needs to change. So if we want, for example, like trans people in Latin America to have meaningful chances at gainful employment, at higher qualities of life, longer lifespans, even though, yes, like they can find work in the informal sector, which in regions like Latin America is just very, very big. The problem is that it's not stable, so just easily, like I said, just as easily as you can get a job, you can just lose your job or lose your life. So it's not so much a net positive, being able to find work in the informal economy as there is, okay, we need to have discussion about how to protect people that the only kind of employment they can find is within the informal sector.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I also want to expand this a little bit beyond Latin America, because I don't personally have much experience in Latin America, but I want to respond to Camilo's point about non-white workers, because I think like that means something specific in the American context that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in other contexts. Colorism is absolutely at play, I think, basically everywhere in the world. We also have various like communitarian pressures around the world, right? But what it means to be white versus non-white is not going to be the same thing everywhere. So for instance, I'm from India, and yeah, I mean, it's a former colonial, the jewel in the crown of Queen Victoria was occupied by the British for a very long time. Rather brutally, as was much of the world. And so yes, obviously there is some sort of preference for white people or views around white people because of that. But fundamentally, like the above 90%, probably, I don't know the exact number, but I'm fully willing to commit to above 90% of people in the labor force in India are not white. But there's still going to be other things based around casteism, or it's really more communitarianism. Some of it is casteism, but a lot of it is just like caste-based issues where people may not actually be thinking about it as caste anymore. The caste system was officially abolished with India's independence, but there are still communities that for a very long time have had more power versus less power, that in the same ways have had less access or more access to education, to resources, to certain types of jobs, that face different types of stereotypical pressures. And so like that is at play everywhere. That's not necessarily what it, you know, who is white, even within the United States, changes a lot. Ibis, you and I have talked about, for instance, like what it means to be Latino in South Florida, and and how the world views you in South Florida versus being Latino in like Pennsylvania, right? It's just, it's a completely different world.
Very, very, yeah, totally. I mean, like I say, like for example, in South Florida, which is very much majority white Cuban, which has its own like reasons and its history. Like, you know, yes, like we are an ethnic minority in the picture of the United States, but when you look at like our Miami-Dade County, for instance, like I'm very much part of the white Cuban majority. And it's also like that wrestling I've had with like, am I a white passing Latina or am I just a white Latina? You know, like it's just like if well over like I think I did my 23andMe, like well over 90% of my ancestry is European. I mean, that puts me pretty much on par with a lot of like Anglo-Americans. So I guess that makes me white too, right? So it's just like all these conversations about how we, you know, perceive our identities, how other people perceive us. I tend to be confused with being Anglo all the time. I even confuse my own people a lot. You know, so it's things that evolve and things that become a lot more transparent, and you know, like I said, intersectionality. Like, so for me right now, I feel most comfortable honestly identifying as a white Latina, because even amongst ourselves, you could be Afro-Latina, you can be Indigenous Latina, you can be non-binary, trans. I mean, there's just, same as like American, there's so many different ways to be American. It's also getting into the differences between, you know, these ethnicities that we thought were just uniform blocks, but we can also have a lot of differences as well between us.
It seems like probably a really good place to end on.
Yes.
So thanks everyone so much for joining us. This was such an interesting discussion. Yeah, thank you so much, Kat and Ibis, for putting it together and letting me be a part of it.
Thank you. Before we go, I'm gonna be the person. Follow everybody on social media. Follow us all, but more specifically, follow, you can find Ladies of Liberty and Feminists for Liberty.
Yes, thank you, Ladies of Liberty, for doing this too.
Yes, yes, thank you.
What's the LOLA handle on Twitter?
Pardon me? It's at Ladies of Liberty on Twitter and at Feminist Liberty on Twitter, and
yeah, let me put I'll put my thing and my contact information in the chat, so if anybody wants to follow me. So.
Fantastic. Yes, and please, 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 if you are hiring and you need a diversity consultant, look for Ibis Valdes Consulting, LLC. And if you are looking to make donations to make more conversations like this and more programming and work in the policy world and the politics world happen around these issues, please donate to the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and Feminists for Liberty.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.